Long before memory learned how to write itself down, there was a morning when a fertile valley fell silent, as if the world had briefly forgotten how to continue. Imagine a clay tablet, still warm from the kiln, lying half buried in ash that never cooled. Traveller, you're not here by chance. Something ancient has drawn your attention to this moment, to a question that refuses to stay buried. What if the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not myth or metaphor, but a real event releasing energy rivaling the most extreme forces humanity would only rediscover millennia later? A light brighter than any sun at dawn, a pressure wave that rewrote stone soil and memory itself. Between Sumerian tablets and modern physics patterns begin to echo across time. Stay with me. Let's drift a little deeper and listen to what the silence remembers. Long before memory learned how to organize itself into scripture or monument, there was a morning when a fertile valley fell unnaturally silent, as if the world itself hesitated. The air did not move as it should. Birds did not rise. Shadows behaved strangely stretched thin beneath a light that felt wrong. What remained afterward was not simply ruin, but absent soil that resisted life water, that carried bitterness and a stillness that seemed to press downward. This is where the story begins, not with gods or judgment, but with an interruption in the ordinary rhythm of existence. Traveller, you are not here by chance. Across centuries of forgetting and remembering, something subtle has guided your attention to this moment. In the quiet hours when instruments hum softly and maps of lost landscapes gather, dust patterns emerge that do not ask to be believed, only noticed. What if the universe stores its memories not only in stars and stone, but in human warnings repeated until language itself wears thin? What if some stories endure because they describe something too real to erase? The land once known as the Kikar was not mythical in its prosperity. It was practical, irrigated, structured, and economically alive. Gravity drew people there because gravity draws everything downward. Water trade, power, ambition. Low places become crowded with complexity, and complexity creates fragility. Modern systems behave the same way. The more efficient and interconnected they become, the more sudden their collapse when thresholds are crossed. Ancient valleys were no different. Balance existed, but it was conditional, resting on forces that did not negotiate. Scientific language tells us that extreme energy does not destroy politely. It overwhelms. It rewrites matter at a fundamental level, altering chemistry, structure, and future possibility. Soil saturated with salt does not recover easily. Radiation, once introduced, lingers as a whisper rather than a shout, changing outcomes quietly and persistently. Ancient writers lack these terms, but they recognized the effects. They warned of poisoned ground, of lands abandoned for generations, of the danger of looking back, not as morality but as exposure. As I read these accounts often late into the night, there is no sense of triumph in recognition, only humility. Because when myth and physics describe the same event from opposite ends of time, certainty becomes less important than coherence. Fire from the heavens is not a theological claim when it behaves like a measurable phenomenon. Smoke rising like a furnace is not metaphor when it aligns with known patterns of high energy release. Silence afterward is not symbolism when abandonment persists in the archaeological record. The Sumerians, meticulous observers of consequence, wrote with an unsettling calm. Their tablets do not read like myths born of imagination, but like reports filed after something went terribly wrong. Decisions are recorded, forces are named obliquely, outcomes are accepted without celebration. There is no glory in their tone, only resignation. In their worldview, power was administrative before it was divine. Authority was something exercised, monitored, and sometimes misjudged. Gravity acts as memory in these stories. It pulls debris fall out and consequence downward, concentrating them in the same places where life once concentrated. Erosion becomes time, thinking slowly, smoothing edges, while preserving scars deep enough to endure. Even when cities vanish, the land remembers. Salt does not forget. Empty basins where trade once flowed do not lie. Geography becomes testimony long after belief systems change. I often imagine the final hours not with drama, but with restraint. Animals reacting first systems, failing quietly, air behaving in ways that do not match expectation. A brightness too intense to be processed. Heat arriving faster than fear. Then the sudden erasure of normality. Not apocalypse as spectacle, but as interruption. The kind of ending that leaves no room for interpretation among those who survive it, only the necessity to leave and never return. Over time, this necessity hardens into taboo. Taboo becomes law. Law becomes culture. Culture persists even after the original cause is forgotten. This is how catastrophe becomes inheritance, not as memory but as instinct. People learn not to settle certain lands. They learn to fear sudden light unnatural wind-poisoned water. They encode these fears into story ritual and prohibition because direct explanation would paralyze rather than protect. In the end, awakening is not about uncovering a hidden truth that changes everything overnight. It is about recognizing a pattern that repeats when restraint fails, and power outruns wisdom. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved quickly. Some exist to slow us down, to remind us that intelligence does not grant immunity from consequence. Silence, after all, is the universe thinking. Tonight the universe whispers again, it's all right. To not understand. Morning light reveals what night tries to soften. In the quiet, after speculation fades, evidence remains patient and indifferent. Stone does not argue, soil does not persuade, it simply records. When archaeologists brush away dust in places long avoided, they do not uncover answers so much as sequences layers of what came before and what could not come after. In the valley near the Dead Sea, the earth speaks in absence. Cities appear abruptly in history, and then vanish just as abruptly, leaving gaps so wide they feel intentional. For centuries nothing grows where careful agriculture once flourished. Traveller evidence is rarely dramatic when encountered directly. It does not arrive as revelation but as discomfort. A question forms not because something is present, but because something is missing. Why would a fertile corridor strategically positioned and economically valuable be abandoned for generations? Ancient people did not fear good land. They did not leave water trade routes and arable soil behind without reason. Migration leaves traces, war leaves debris, floods leave sediment. But here the land itself appears altered, resistant, as though it remembers something the people chose to forget. Modern science offers language where ancient memory offers warning. Soil chemistry reveals abnormal salinity not explained by slow environmental drift. Salt concentrations spike in patterns inconsistent with gradual evaporation alone. This is not the patient work of climate. It is abrupt, sudden, as if hypersaline water were lifted, dispersed and laid down across fields in a single violent moment. Salt once embedded at such levels becomes a long-term eraser. Seeds fail. Roots burn. Recovery stretches not across seasons but centuries. Fragments of melted material complicate the picture further. Pottery shards vitrified on their outer surfaces but not within. Mud bricks warped and bubbled as though briefly exposed to temperatures far exceeding anything ancient kilns could produce. These are not signs of prolonged fire. They are signatures of heat arriving too quickly to penetrate evenly. In physics, such patterns belong to short extreme thermal pulses. Heat intense enough to alter molecular structure before time itself can respond. Then there are the microscopic witnesses. Spherules of iron and silica cooled droplets formed only when matter is vaporized and rapidly condensed while airborne. Shocked quartz bearing internal fractures that form only under immense instantaneous pressure. These are not poetic findings, they are mechanical. They narrow the field of possibility ruthlessly. Such features emerge from meteor impacts or high-energy explosions. They do not arise from city fires, earthquakes, or human conflict as it was known in the Bronze Age. At Tall El Hammam these clues converge. A major urban centre, fortified, organised alive for centuries ending in a single destruction layer more than a metre thick. Walls flattened outward, not collapsed inward. Human remains scattered, fragmented, sometimes fused with debris. Death here was not sequential. It was simultaneous, not personal, not selective. An erasure event. Archaeology does not interpret intention, but it records aftermath faithfully. And the aftermath here speaks with unsettling clarity. Skepticism remains essential. Science does not rush to conclusion. A high-altitude airburst caused by a cosmic object offers one plausible mechanism. History remembers such events, though rarely at this scale. The Tunguska explosion of 1908 flattened forests without leaving a crater. Scale that force upward, place it above a populated valley, the physical record aligns. But mechanism alone does not explain narrative consistency. Cosmic objects do not send messengers ahead of time. They do not warn survivors where to flee or what not to do. This is where evidence and memory intersect uneasily. Ancient texts describe warnings that sound procedural rather than moral. Do not remain in the lowlands, do not look back, leave immediately. These are not ethical instructions. They are survival guidelines consistent with exposure to blast heat and fallout. Distance matters, direction matters, timing matters. Ancient writers preserved effects without knowing causes, encoding them into story, because story was the safest vessel available. As someone who has spent long nights comparing maps, data, and damaged tablets, I find no comfort in certainty here. Evidence does not collapse mystery, it deepens it. When geology and narrative converge, the space between them becomes the most important territory. It is there that humility belongs. Because evidence does not tell us who acted or why. It only tells us that something occurred which exceeded the limits of its time. Dust settles eventually. Chronology rebuilds itself slowly. But some events introduce a discontinuity so sharp that history itself changes direction. After this destruction, settlement patterns shift. Populations avoid low basins, agricultural ambition contracts. Memory transforms into taboo. The environment enforces what belief systems later explain. Even when names fade, behavior persists. In laboratories, we speak of thresholds, points beyond which systems behave differently. Ancient societies did not use this language, but they lived with its consequences. The evidence suggests that such a threshold was crossed here, briefly catastrophically. What followed was not recovery, but adaptation to loss. Civilization continued elsewhere, smaller, more cautious, shaped by what had proven possible. In the end, traveller evidence does not demand belief. It invites attention. It asks us to sit with uncertainty without reaching too quickly for comfort. Some mysteries wait, others watch. And tonight, as the data rests quietly beneath layers of sand and time, it is all right to not understand. Night settles differently over anomalies. The sky appears unchanged, yet something beneath it refuses to align. Instruments can be calibrated, maps corrected, timelines adjusted, but there remains a residue that does not fit. An anomaly is not simply an error in data. It is a signal that the framework itself may be incomplete. In the long silence surrounding the destruction of the cities of the plain, such signals accumulate quietly, asking not for belief but for patience. Traveller anomalies are where science becomes contemplative. They are the moments when explanation slows and observation deepens. In this case, the anomaly is not only physical but narrative. Across cultures separated by distance and language, the same elements recur with unsettling precision. A sudden light, overwhelming vision. Heat arriving instantaneously. Winds that follow carrying sickness rather than relief. Land rendered barren long after flames subside. These are not the motifs of gradual disaster. They describe abrupt transition, a world functioning normally until it does not. In physics, systems pushed beyond tolerance do not degrade gracefully. They change state. Water becomes steam. Sand becomes glass. Stability persists until a threshold is crossed invisibly, and then the transformation is immediate. The ancient accounts preserve this structure intuitively. They do not describe siege, drought, or decay. They describe interruption. One moment of ordinary life followed by conditions so altered that return is impossible. This pattern is the anomaly that refuses to fade. The Sumerian records complicate matters further. Their language, administrative and restrained, lacks the embellishment expected of myth. When they speak of destructive forces, they describe them as tools rather than tempers. Winds are released, radiance is unleashed, decisions are weighed, consequences follow. The tone suggests governance rather than storytelling. It is as if the scribes were documenting failure rather than celebrating victory, aware that what had occurred exceeded acceptable bounds. An anomaly also appears in what follows the destruction. History often lingers on rebuilding conquest or transformation. Here it does not. The narrative moves away as though the land itself has been written off. Silence replaces description. This absence is not neglect, it is avoidance. Places where something went catastrophically wrong are often erased from detailed memory because specificity offers no utility. Only warning survives. From a scientific perspective, long-term land abandonment on this scale is rare without persistent contamination. Soil can recover from fire, floods deposit nutrients, even earthquakes invite reconstruction. But salinization, chemical alteration, and lingering toxicity resist human effort. Ancient farmers understood this empirically. They did not argue with land. They tested it. When crops failed repeatedly, they left. Practicality, not fear, guided their decision. The anomaly deepens when astronomy enters the picture. Ancient cultures track the sky obsessively, not for wonder alone, but for prediction. Celestial events governed planting, travel ritual, and caution. Sudden light from above carried meaning because the sky was assumed stable. When stability breaks, interpretation shifts. Fire from heaven is not assigned lightly. It signals an event that violates expectation so completely that language defaults to agency because randomness offers no reassurance. As a scientist, I am trained to resist intention where mechanism suffices, but as a human I recognize that intention is often inferred when consequence is too precise to feel accidental. The anomaly here is not whether a high-energy event occurred, but whether it occurred without anticipation. Ancient warnings suggest foreknowledge, evacuation before impact, specific instructions, selective survival. These details strain purely natural explanations without fully embracing alternative ones. I've spent many nights tracing these contradictions, instruments glowing softly beside me, charts spread across tables like quiet arguments. Each anomaly invites restraint rather than conclusion. Because certainty is seductive and seduction has led humanity astray before, the universe does not owe us clarity. It offers patterns. Whether we impose meaning upon them or learn humility from them determines what follows. Anomalies persist because they serve a function. They prevent closure. They keep inquiry alive without allowing it to become dangerous. In this sense, the anomaly surrounding Sodom and Gomorrah acts as a boundary. It marks a region of history where explanation slows deliberately, where science and myth overlap without resolving into one another, where the responsible position is not mastery but caution. There is also a human anomaly embedded here. The emotional residue of sudden annihilation shapes behavior long after details vanish. Fear of abrupt endings becomes cultural instinct. Law emphasizes prevention over forgiveness. Obedience becomes maintenance. Knowledge becomes tiered, restricted, weighted morally. These are not arbitrary developments. They are adaptive responses to trauma encoded across generations. When anomalies accumulate without resolution, societies choose between denial and ritualization. The ancient world chose ritual. Fire became controlled. Smoke rose predictably. Salt was used symbolically to neutralize danger. By reenacting catastrophe in contained forms, people learned to live beside memory without being consumed by it. This is not superstition. It is psychological engineering. In modern context, anomalies often provoke acceleration. More data, more power, more control. The ancient response was the opposite: reduction, containment, restraint. The anomaly taught them that some forces once unleashed do not respect intention. They operate according to physics rather than desire. This realization quietly reshaped civilization's trajectory. In the end, Traveller and Anomaly is not a problem to be solved, but a mirror held up to our assumptions. It asks whether we seek understanding to align with reality or to dominate it. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Others, tonight as the anomaly remains unresolved yet deeply instructive, it is all right to not understand. After catastrophe, silence is not emptiness. It is presence without voice. It lingers where explanation has failed and certainty has withdrawn. In the valley once crowded with trade water and ordered, life silence settled like a second landscape layered atop the first. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of something finished. Stone remained, soil remained. But intention had departed. What followed was not mourning in words, but abandonment in practice, a decision repeated silently by generation after generation. Traveller silence is how the universe records what cannot be negotiated. Where memory fractures, behaviour persists. People did not gather to debate what happened in this place. They simply did not return. This absence is itself evidence, though it does not argue. It endures. In science, we learn to respect null results, the spaces where expected signals do not appear. Here, silence functions the same way. It is the signal. The land did not invite interpretation, it imposed consequence. Fields failed repeatedly, water tasted wrong, air carried heaviness. These sensations do not require belief to be persuasive. Ancient societies were pragmatic. They tested ground with seed, not philosophy. When effort yielded nothing, when loss repeated itself without explanation, silence became wisdom. Leave. Do not build. Do not invest life where life resists. Over time, silence hardened into geography. Maps adjusted. Routes bent around the dead zone. Trade corridors shifted. The valley became a scar that shaped movement without demanding attention. This is how catastrophe integrates itself into the ordinary. Not as spectacle, but as constraint. Gravity does not announce itself. It simply pulls. In my own work, I have learned that silence often arrives after instruments fail to measure what matters most. Radiation whispers rather than shouts. Contamination persists without display. Effects outlast events. Long nights spent watching data streams flatten after spikes teach humility. The most dangerous forces are not always dramatic. They are patient. The silence surrounding Sodom and Gomorrah does not resolve into moral clarity. It does not instruct directly. It conditions. Generations born far from the valley inherited caution without knowing its origin. Sacred boundaries emerged. Low places became suspect. Sudden light inspired fear. Winds carried meaning. These responses did not require understanding. They required survival. Silence also reshaped narrative. When explanation offers no comfort, story compresses. Details fade. Mechanism dissolves. What remains is warning stripped to its essentials. Fire fell. The land died. Do not repeat. This compression is not distortion. It is adaptation. Excess detail invites curiosity. Curiosity invites repetition. Silence prevents both. In scientific terms, this is risk management encoded culturally. Instead of manuals, societies preserved instinct. Instead of equations, they preserved taboo. This is not ignorance. It is restraint disguised as myth. The modern tendency to dismiss such inheritance as superstition misunderstands its function. Superstition does not persist for millennia without utility. Silence also entered governance. Authority learned caution. Absolute power revealed itself as dangerous when exercised without limit. Councils replaced singular decree. Ritual delayed action. Law slowed escalation. These structures did not emerge from idealism. They emerged from memory encoded in absence. Concentrated power had once erased cities. Silence taught restraint. The gods, too, grew quieter. Direct intervention became rare. Fire receded into metaphor. Presence withdrew into symbol. Sacred spaces became controlled interfaces rather than shared domains. Mountains replaced valleys. Distance replaced intimacy. This theological shift mirrors physical reality. After exposure to overwhelming force proximity becomes intolerable, silence transformed time as well. The future no longer assumed continuity. It became conditional. Prophecy emerged not as prediction, but as caution. Endings entered imagination because endings had occurred. Apocalyptic language carried sensory accuracy inherited from experience. Light too bright, heat too fast, wind that sickened, darkness after brilliance. These are not inventions, they are echoes, yet silence did not halt life. Civilization continued elsewhere, smaller, slower, more cautious. Innovation persisted within limits. Fire was domesticated, knowledge tiered, Advancement tested socially before adoption. Acceleration became suspect. The memory of abrupt erasure lingered like an unspoken rule: do not push too far. As centuries passed, silence thinned. The original event slipped beyond direct recollection. The land remained barren, but explanation drifted. Moral frameworks replaced mechanical ones. Judgment replaced consequence. This reinterpretation allowed societies to function without paralysis. Fear softened into doctrine, doctrine into tradition. Still, silence persisted beneath interpretation. It re-emerged whenever ambition surged too quickly, whenever systems grew dense and efficient, whenever power concentrated without counterbalance. The unease returned without name. People sensed danger before they could articulate it. This is how deep memory survives, not as story but as instinct. In modern terms, we might call this distributed trauma. The experience of annihilation reshaped cognition across generations. Risk assessment became conservative. Change required justification. Stability became virtue. Endurance replaced transformation as the measure of success. Civilizations learned to value longevity over brilliance. Silence also shaped art and architecture. Permanence mattered. Stone replaced fragile materials. Proportion emphasized balance. Even monuments aimed to endure rather than astonish. The memory of sudden ruin haunted design choices. Height became less important than stability. Fire was controlled, symmetrical, ritualized. As a scientist-poet, I find solace in this restraint. It speaks of humility earned rather than preached. The ancient world lacked our language, but it possessed wisdom shaped by consequence. Silence taught them what no explanation could, that some forces once released do not negotiate. Tonight, as we sit with this silence, it is tempting to fill it, to resolve uncertainty with assertion. But silence has its own instruction. It invites listening rather than speaking, observation rather than intervention, acceptance rather than mastery. In the end, traveller's silence is not absence of meaning. It is meaning without demand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. And as the quiet of this ancient valley stretches across time into this moment, it is all right to not understand. Time does not erase evenly. It does not smooth the past into a single texture. Instead, it forgets selectively, preserving fragments while dissolving context. What remains is not a clear memory, but an epoch shaped by omission. After the silence settled over the valley, after roots bent away and names thinned into warning, humanity entered what can only be described as a forgotten epoch, a stretch of time defined not by what was known, but by what was carefully avoided. Traveller forgetting is not always failure. Sometimes it is protection. When an experience exceeds the capacity of language, the mind does not preserve it intact. It compresses, it abstracts, it relocates fear into symbol and habit. Entire generations can live inside the behavioral shadow of an event they no longer remember directly. This is how epochs disappear without vanishing. They become invisible frameworks shaping choice. In the centuries following, the destruction progress did not stop, but it slowed, changed rhythm, lost its appetite for sudden leaps. People rebuilt elsewhere, favouring higher ground, dispersed settlements, and redundancy over efficiency. Cities grew, but cautiously. Systems avoided over-concentration. This was not stagnation. It was recalibration. Civilization learned to breathe differently. Archaeology reveals this shift quietly. Construction becomes simpler. Trade networks shorten. Monumental ambition recedes. Writing persists, but its tone changes. Less celebration, more accounting, less prophecy, more instruction. Knowledge narrows and deepens rather than expanding wildly. These are not signs of decline, they are signs of restraint encoded into culture. The forgotten epoch is not empty of innovation. Fire is refined, metallurgy advances, agriculture stabilizes, but each advancement arrives slowly tested socially before spreading widely. Iron replaces bronze, not as revolution but as transition. Writing spreads cautiously. New tools are integrated into existing structures rather than allowed to disrupt them. Acceleration is distrusted. This distrust is often misunderstood by later historians. It is labelled conservatism, fear, superstition. But fear implies ignorance. What existed instead was memory without image, a sense that some boundaries exist for reasons no longer visible, a knowledge that speed magnifies error, that scale magnifies consequence. These insights do not require explanation to remain effective. Myths from this period speak obliquely. Lost golden ages, floods, fire, gods who withdraw after transgression. Knowledge sealed away. These are not fantasies of ignorance. They are compressed histories of loss. The idea that the past was more advanced lingers uncomfortably alongside fear of repeating it. Progress becomes something to approach indirectly with caution and ritual. In this forgotten epoch, education becomes tiered. Basic skills spread widely. Advanced knowledge becomes restricted. Apprenticeship replaces experimentation. Mastery requires patience. Impulsiveness is punished. Curiosity remains, but it is guided. This structure is not anti-intellectual. It is risk-aware. Capability without maturity had proven catastrophic once. Religion adapts accordingly. The divine becomes associated with order, covenant, and continuity rather than raw power. Miracles grow rare. Revelation slows. Gods speak through tradition instead of fire. The sacred is domesticated enough to be survivable. This theological shift mirrors a psychological one. Proximity to overwhelming force is no longer desired. The environment reinforces these lessons relentlessly. Regions damaged by ancient events never fully recover. Dead zones persist. Saline soils resist cultivation. These scars stand as permanent counterarguments to hubris. No philosophy can make poisoned land fertile again. Reality remains stubborn. The land itself becomes a teacher. As centuries pass, explanations drift. The catastrophe is attributed to moral failure, divine wrath, or cosmic imbalance. These narratives differ, but the behavioral outcome remains consistent restraint. The reason may change, the rule does not. This is how forgotten epochs persist, through continuity of action rather than clarity of cause. From my own perspective, studying this period feels like listening to someone speak in a language missing half its words. The grammar remains, the meaning survives. But the origin has been lost. Dustcoats maps, instruments hum quietly. The deeper I look, the more I realize that certainty is not only unnecessary but dangerous. The forgotten epoch did not need explanation to function. It needed boundaries. This period also reshaped humanity's relationship with time. Early societies thought cyclically. Seasons returned, ages repeated. After destruction, confidence fractured. The future became conditional. Prophecy emerges not as destiny, but as warning. The end of the world is no longer abstract. It has precedent. This awareness alters behavior profoundly. Apocalyptic language carries specific sensory markers inherited from the ancient event. Light overwhelming vision, heat arriving instantly, winds carrying sickness, darkness following brightness. These motifs recur with remarkable consistency across cultures. They are not invented for drama. They are remembered impressions reshaped into caution. Yet despite this caution, humanity does not retreat into paralysis. Life continues. Children are born, songs are sung, tools improve. The forgotten epoch is not bleak. It is careful. It values endurance over brilliance. Longevity becomes proof of wisdom. Anything that burns brightly and briefly is suspect. Art reflects this orientation. Permanence is valued over spectacle. Stone replaces fragile materials. Proportions emphasize stability. Even monumental projects aim to endure rather than astonish. The memory of a sudden ruin haunts design choices. Architecture becomes an argument for patience. Over time, this epoch fades further. Its lessons become habits. Habits become traditions. Traditions become obstacles. Later civilizations inherit restraint without memory. Boundaries persist, but their purpose fades. Limits become targets rather than safeguards. This erosion is gradual and quiet. It feels like progress. But beneath surface narratives, the forgotten epoch continues to whisper. It surfaces whenever societies debate limits, responsibility, and consequence. Whenever new technologies provoke instinctive discomfort. Whenever speed feels dangerous, even without explanation. The instinct remains even when its origin is unknown. In the end, Traveller: The Forgotten Epoch is not a lost chapter to be rediscovered fully. It is a structural inheritance shaping civilization's rhythm. It taught humanity to pause, consolidate, and breathe. It demonstrated that survival does not require dominance, only balance. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight, as this forgotten time drifts quietly beneath our awareness, it is all right to not understand. Resets do not announce themselves as endings. They arrive as interruptions, moments when continuity fractures, and what survives must reorganize itself around loss. After the forgotten epoch settled into habit and tradition, civilization carried forward a quieter inheritance, the knowledge that progress could not simply resume where it had been interrupted. It had to begin again differently under conditions imposed by what had already been broken. Traveller: A reset is not erasure, it is compression. What remains is stripped of excess refined by necessity. In nature, this process is visible everywhere. Forests burn, then regrow with different composition. Rivers change course, carving new valleys through old sediment. Life does not restore itself exactly. It adapts to the constraints left behind. Human civilization behaves no differently, though it often resists the comparison. The ancient reset did not wipe humanity clean. It narrowed options. Large, dense systems dissolved into smaller, more flexible ones. Authority fragmented, trade localized, populations dispersed. This was not ideological choice. It was mechanical outcome. Systems optimized for efficiency proved brittle when shock exceeded tolerance. Survivors learned quickly that resilience favored simplicity over scale. Archaeological layers reflect this adjustment clearly. After abrupt destruction, there is a pause. Then reoccupation appears lighter, less ambitious, more provisional. Materials are reused. Settlements shift to defensible terrain. Infrastructure emphasizes repair over expansion. These choices are often framed as regression by later observers, but regression implies comparison to an ideal that no longer exists. Reset implies alignment with reality. During this period, humanity relearns boundaries. Fire is still used, but carefully. Metals are shaped, but slowly. Knowledge spreads through apprenticeship rather than proclamation. Each skill is paired with discipline. Mastery is not celebrated for its own sake, but for its reliability. Capability without restraint had already demonstrated its cost. Myths from this era carry the signature of reset. Stories of great floods, fallen towers, shattered heavens, and scattered peoples recur across continents. They differ in detail but converge in structure. Something unified was broken. Something ambitious was scattered. Survival followed through reduction. These myths do not mourn loss endlessly. They normalize it. Reset also reshapes ethics. Moral systems emphasize vigilance rather than repentance after the fact. Obedience becomes preventive maintenance. Law becomes a stabilizing technology designed to delay catastrophe, not merely punish wrongdoing. In this environment, knowledge itself becomes morally weighted. Not all understanding is considered beneficial at all times. Certain forms of inquiry are restricted, framed as dangerous or forbidden. Myths of sealed wisdom, hidden names, and lost books proliferate. These are not anti-intellectual impulses. They are attempts to manage risk by controlling access. The figure of the forbidden teacher appears repeatedly sympathetic, brilliant, tragic. His punishment reinforces the lesson that premature knowledge invites destruction. This is the paradox of reset. It preserves civilization by slowing it, yet it also creates longing. People sense that something greater once existed. Fragments of old understanding surface, occasionally provoking both excitement and fear. Each rediscovery tests the boundaries established by survival. Sometimes it strengthens them, sometimes it weakens them. From my own perspective, studying this phase feels like watching a civilization teach itself to walk again after injury. Movements are cautious. Balance matters more than speed. Progress advances in short steps followed by long pauses. Advance, consolidate, pause again. This rhythm becomes cultural. It embeds itself into expectation. Reset also alters humanity's relationship with nature. The environment is no longer merely a resource, it is a participant. Floods, droughts, and storms are interpreted as signs of imbalance. Human activity is scrutinized for its effect on cosmic order. Environmental ethics emerge not from sentimentality, but from fear earned through consequence. Sacred groves, protected rivers, and taboo landscapes proliferate. These restrictions function as early conservation. Land left alone recovers. Resources last longer. Survival improves. The justification is religious. The effect is practical. The reset teaches through constraint. Even warfare internalizes this lesson. Ritualized combat codes of honor and rules of engagement develop. Total war becomes an aberration feared even by those who practice violence. The ancient catastrophe acts as a negative blueprint. It defines what must be avoided. Everything else organizes itself around that absence. As generations pass, the reset hardens into identity. Stability becomes virtue. Innovation is tolerated only when framed as restoration rather than transformation. Even revolutions seek legitimacy in the past. Change is acceptable only if it appears familiar. This backward-looking orientation reflects deep discomfort with untested futures. Yet resets do not last forever. Memory thins. Boundaries soften. What was once necessity becomes tradition. Tradition becomes burden. The very structures that preserved civilization begin to feel restrictive. Ambition returns quietly. Confidence rebuilds itself on uninterrupted success. Still, the reset leaves traces that never fully disappear. It shapes how societies treat escalation. Small conflicts are tolerated. Large ones are feared. Leaders justify action, carefully framing it as defensive or inevitable. Violence becomes bureaucratic, constrained by procedure. Uncontrolled force remains taboo long after its origin is forgotten. Technology follows the same path. Innovations promising efficiency are welcomed. Those threatening disruption are delayed, debated, or suppressed. Progress becomes incremental by design. This is not stagnation. It is survival strategy. Humanity learned that speed magnifies error. In modern terms, we might describe this as resilience over optimization. The ancient reset prioritized systems that could fail without collapsing entirely. Redundancy mattered. Buffer zones mattered. Slow decision-making mattered. These features reduced peak performance, but increased longevity. As a scientist living with mysteries rather than solutions, I find the reset instructive. It demonstrates that intelligence alone does not ensure survival. Alignment with limits does. The ancient world learned this through loss. The reset was not chosen. It was imposed. Tonight, as we consider this reset, there is no need to mourn what was lost or to glorify what followed. The reset simply happened. It shaped civilization's rhythm quietly, persistently. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Sleep traveler. The cosmos will keep watch. Echoes are not repetitions. They are distortions shaped by distance, surface, and time. What returns is never identical to what was released. It arrives, softened, delayed, altered yet unmistakably related to its source. After the reset settled into habit and restraint, hardened into culture, echoes of the ancient catastrophe began to surface in subtler ways. Not as memory, not as warnings spoken aloud, but as patterns reappearing where they were least expected. Traveller and echo is how the past survives when memory fails. It does not announce itself as history. It arrives as instinct, discomfort, hesitation. It emerges when societies approach thresholds they cannot clearly define but somehow recognize. Long after the cities of the plain had vanished from maps, the structure of their destruction continued to influence how humanity imagined danger, power, and consequence. Across distant regions, similar myths emerged independently. Fire stolen from the heavens. Knowledge that arrives too quickly. Gifts that cannot be returned once opened. These stories differ in language and symbolism, but they converge in outcome. Something is taken or unleashed. Balance breaks. Punishment follows not as judgment, but as inevitability. The echo preserves sequence rather than detail. In the laboratory, echoes appear as anomalies. In datasets, patterns recurring where randomness should dominate. In culture, they appear as recurring anxieties. Fear of sudden endings, fear of brightness, fear of invisible contamination. Even when no rational explanation is offered, the response remains consistent. Avoid, delay, contain. These instincts do not require belief to function. The echo also shapes how societies talk about progress. Advancement is framed cautiously. Breakthroughs are celebrated but hedged. Language emphasizes control, safety, responsibility. Even in eras of confidence, an undercurrent of unease persists. What if this goes too far? What if this cannot be undone? These questions surfaced repeatedly, even when evidence suggests success. As humanity expands geographically, the echo travels with it. New lands are settled with old myths already in place. Taboos precede experience. People fear repeating disasters they have never witnessed. This preemptive fear prevents some mistakes and delays others. It does not halt progress, it modulates it. Environmental behavior reflects this modulation. Landscapes are not merely exploited, they are negotiated with. Sacred restrictions limit extraction. Rituals regulate use. These practices persist even when their original justification fades. The echo remains embedded in habit. Do not take too much. Do not disturb certain places. Do not assume abundance is permanent. The echo also appears in governance. Authority fragments into councils, senates, assemblies. Absolute power is treated with suspicion. Even kings bind themselves to ritual, law, and tradition. Concentrated decision-making had once proven catastrophic. Dispersal becomes a safeguard. This structural caution appears repeatedly across civilizations without direct contact. In warfare, the echo manifests as reluctance toward total destruction. Codes of honor, rules of engagement, and ritualized conflict emerge. While often violated, their existence indicates aspiration toward controlled violence. Total war remains an aberration feared even by those who practice it. The ancient catastrophe defines what must be avoided. As centuries pass, the echo grows quieter but not weaker. It becomes abstract. The original cities are forgotten. The land remains barren, but explanations drift. Gods, demons, and moral failure replace mechanical consequence. Yet behavior remains consistent. Restraint persists even when rationale changes. I often notice this echo during long nights with instruments and notes spread before me. When data suggests a possibility that feels disproportionate to its benefit, hesitation arises before calculation completes. This is not fear. It is alignment with something older than reason, a sense that not all questions should be answered immediately, that some doors once opened do not close. The echo intensifies whenever humanity encounters new forms of concentrated power. Energy density increases, distance collapses, speed accelerates. Suddenly old metaphors feel literal again. Fire from heaven becomes a description rather than allegory. Poisoned winds resemble fallout. Salted lands resemble contamination. What once seemed symbolic now reads as technical. At these moments, ancient stories are reinterpreted. Scholars revisit texts once dismissed as myth. Archaeologists re-examine ruins once romanticized. The past becomes uncomfortably relevant. The echo grows louder, not because history repeats, but because structure aligns. This alignment produces tension. On one hand, humanity prides itself on progress and rationality. On the other, it recognizes patterns it has seen before recorded by people who lacked modern language but not modern fear. The echo refuses to stay buried. It challenges the assumption that advancement equals safety. In response, societies oscillate. Periods of rapid innovation are followed by calls for regulation, ethics, and restraint. Each cycle mirrors ancient attempts to contain dangerous power, translated into contemporary terms. The language changes, the concern does not. The echo also reshapes how humanity defines success. Greatness becomes endurance rather than transformation. Civilizations measure achievement in centuries rather than moments. Longevity becomes proof of wisdom. Anything that burns brightly and briefly is suspect. This redefinition influences art architecture and ambition. Yet echoes distort. Over time, caution can harden into fear. Fear can inhibit necessary adaptation. The same instinct that prevents catastrophe can also delay response to slow-moving threats. Balance becomes delicate. Too much restraint invites stagnation. Too little invites collapse. The ancient echo does not offer instructions. It offers calibration. It reminds civilization that capability and consequence are linked even when connection is invisible. It does not prohibit progress. It demands humility. As memory thins further, the echo risks becoming noise. Stories lose weight. Warnings blur into entertainment. Apocalyptic imagery becomes spectacle rather than instruction. The emotional signal reverses. What once repelled now attracts. This is perhaps the most dangerous distortion of all. When catastrophe becomes aesthetic, it loses its power to teach. The echo fades not because it is false, but because it is no longer felt. Yet physical reality remains indifferent to narrative. Systems fail according to laws, not stories. Thresholds do not negotiate. In the end, traveller and echo is not destiny. It is opportunity. It allows learning without repetition. Whether it is heard depends on attention. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight, as echoes ripple quietly through history and into this moment, it is all right to not understand. Patterns do not reveal themselves all at once. They emerge slowly through repetition, through the quiet alignment of events that seem unrelated until distance allows them to be seen together. What survives catastrophe is not detail but structure. After echoes of the ancient destruction settled into instinct and culture, humanity began to move within an invisible framework shaped by what had once gone too far. This framework was not taught, it was inherited. Traveller pattern is memory stripped of narrative. It does not explain itself, it simply repeats. In nature, patterns govern tides, seasons, erosion. In civilization, they govern ambition, restraint, rise and contraction. When we look closely at long arcs of human history, the same sequence appears again and again. Expansion, concentration, confidence, strain, warning, delay, correction, loss, then rebuilding under narrower conditions. The pattern is not moral, it is mechanical. Systems accumulate complexity because complexity promises efficiency and control. Complexity concentrates power because coordination requires authority. Authority accelerates decision-making because delay feels dangerous when systems grow dense. This acceleration creates momentum. Momentum narrows options. Eventually thresholds are crossed not through malice, but through continuity. The ancient catastrophe followed this structure precisely. So have countless collapses since, though none so sudden or absolute. The forgotten epoch, the reset, and the echo were not separate phenomena. They were stages within a single pattern unfolding over time. What differed between eras was not the structure, but humanity's awareness of it. Ancient societies sensed the pattern intuitively. They lacked language to describe systemic risk, but they recognized outcome. When land died, when cities vanished, when silence followed ambition, the pattern became undeniable. Later societies inherited fragments of this recognition without its context. They learned restraint as a habit rather than understanding. This inheritance shaped how progress unfolded. Innovation did not vanish, it became incremental. Each advancement was tested socially before becoming widespread. Writing spread slowly. Metallurgy advanced cautiously. Large-scale infrastructure emerged only after generations of familiarity. This was not technological inferiority. It was pattern-aware behaviour. I have often traced this pattern late-at-night charts, spread across my desk eras, layered like transparent maps that refuse to align perfectly. Each civilization believes itself unique, driven by unprecedented conditions. Yet when viewed from sufficient distance, similarities overwhelm differences. The same curve rises. The same strain appears. The same hesitation arrives too late or too early. The pattern also explains why warnings so often fail. Warnings operate within narrative. Patterns operate beneath it. A warning requires belief. A pattern does not. It expresses itself regardless of interpretation. This is why civilizations can acknowledge danger intellectually while continuing behavior structurally aligned with collapse. Awareness without alteration does not break pattern. Language evolves to accommodate this tension. Societies develop terms that soften consequence, acceptable loss, manageable risk, collateral impact. These phrases allow continuation without confrontation. They transform thresholds into probabilities, making irreversible outcomes feel negotiable. This linguistic adaptation is itself part of the pattern. In the ancient world, such language didn't exist. Consequence arrived visibly and swiftly. The pattern asserted itself without abstraction. Modern systems diffuse consequence across time and space, allowing pattern to proceed quietly until scale magnifies impact beyond containment. This delay creates illusion. Illusion reinforces momentum. The pattern also governs memory. After each collapse, survivors adapt by reducing scale. Systems simplify. Authority fragments. Knowledge narrows. Resilience increases. Over time, success rebuilds confidence. Boundaries soften. Redundancy is labelled inefficiency. Optimization replaces buffering. The pattern restarts. This cycle does not imply futility. It implies rhythm. The danger lies not in repetition but in acceleration. Ancient patterns unfolded over centuries. Modern ones compress into decades or less. Sped collapses reflection. Distance collapses feedback. Scale collapses margin for error. When patterns accelerate, instinct struggles to keep pace. The echo of ancient restraint becomes faint. Models replace memory. Probability replaces fear. Risk becomes acceptable if statistically unlikely, even if consequence is total. This rationalization does not alter structure. It merely delays response. The pattern appears most clearly in how societies treat limits. Early on, limits are respected implicitly. Later, they are questioned. Eventually, they are reframed as obstacles to progress. This reframing marks a critical transition. When limits are treated as negotiable rather than structural pattern, approaches its inflection point. Environmental systems reveal this inflection visibly: soil degradation, water stress, ecosystem simplification. These changes accumulate slowly distributed enough to dismiss. No single event echoes the ancient fire. No singular moment demands retreat. Adaptation replaces prevention. Systems bend. Bending is mistaken for resilience. Yet bending without reduction increases strain. Feedback loops tighten. Correction becomes more difficult. At this stage, pattern recognition becomes essential. But pattern recognition threatens narratives of success. It challenges identity. It demands change without drama. Such demands are rarely welcomed. I often think of pattern as the universe's way of teaching without intention. It does not punish. It does not reward. It responds. When inputs exceed tolerance, outputs change. This is as true for stars as it is for civilizations. Gravity does not negotiate. Neither do thresholds. The ancient catastrophe taught this brutally. The forgotten epic preserved it quietly. The reset operationalized it. The echo transmitted it. Pattern is what remains when all else fades. It is the lesson without language. Modern civilization stands within this pattern consciously for the first time. Data reveals alignment. History offers comparison. The structure is visible. This awareness creates possibility. But awareness alone does not alter pattern. Action must disrupt continuity. Disruption does not require collapse. It requires restraint chosen before enforcement. It requires redefining success away from expansion and toward continuity. It requires valuing what can be sustained over what can be achieved. These choices feel counterintuitive in cultures shaped by growth, yet they align with survival observed after ancient resets. The pattern does not demand fear, it demands humility. Humility to recognize that intelligence does not grant exemption, that capability does not equal control, that systems function until they fail abruptly. That loss once imposed cannot always be reversed. As this realization settles, anxiety often rises. People sense fragility even amid abundance. Trust in permanence erodes. Institutions feel brittle. This psychological environment mirrors conditions preceding ancient collapse when confidence coexisted with unease. The difference now is visibility. The pattern is no longer hidden. Whether recognition leads to alteration remains uncertain. Patterns do not force choice. They constrain outcome. Civilization still moves within margins where redirection is possible. Those margins narrow with momentum. In the end, traveller pattern is neither prophecy nor condemnation. It is a map drawn by consequence. It shows where paths have led before. It does not decide where we must go. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight, as the pattern reveals itself quietly beneath history and beneath us, it is all right to not understand. Warnings rarely arrive as commands. They arrive as unease, as a subtle resistance felt before language forms. By the time a warning becomes explicit, it is often already late. The ancient catastrophe did not announce itself as destiny. It emerged as outcome, the final expression of a trajectory that had already narrowed beyond correction. What followed was not prophecy but precedent. And precedent is quieter than instruction, yet far more persistent. Traveller warning is not fear. Fear paralyzes. A warning calibrates. It adjusts posture before impact. Across civilizations shaped by the memory of sudden annihilation, warnings embedded themselves into habit rather than doctrine. People learned not to press certain boundaries not because they understood them fully, but because pressing them had once erased everything that mattered. The absence of explanation did not weaken the warning, it strengthened it. In the ancient world, warnings were sensory before they were symbolic. The sky behaving incorrectly, animals reacting before people, air carrying unfamiliar weight, water tasting wrong. These signals did not require interpretation. They demanded response. Survival depended on noticing small deviations before they accumulated into irreversible change. This attentiveness became cultural instinct. As memory thinned, warnings shifted form. They entered language as myth and ritual. Stories cautioned against flying too close to the sun, against opening sealed containers, against stealing fire meant for gods. These were not metaphors for curiosity alone. They were compressed instructions about scale and consequence. Do not exceed tolerance. Do not unleash what cannot be governed. Do not confuse capability with wisdom. Over time, warnings migrated into institutions. Councils slowed decisions. Laws emphasized continuity. Ritual delayed action. These mechanisms did not exist to frustrate progress. They existed to create friction where speed threatened stability. Friction is often misunderstood as inefficiency. In reality, it is protection against runaway momentum. The warning also reshaped how humanity viewed knowledge. Not all understanding was considered beneficial at all times. Certain inquiries were restricted not because truth was feared, but because timing mattered. Knowledge released too quickly without maturity or restraint had once magnified harm. This lesson lingered in myths of forbidden books and sealed wisdom. The tragedy of the forbidden teacher reinforced it repeatedly. Insight without discipline invites destruction. In my own work, warnings appear not as alarms but as thresholds quietly approaching. Data curves steepen, variance tightens, margins thin. These are not moments of panic, they are moments of choice. Do we continue because success has carried us this far, or do we pause because success has altered the terrain beneath us? Modern civilization encounters warnings differently. They arrive abstracted into charts, probabilities, and projections. They are mediated through institutions designed to translate risk into acceptable ranges. This translation dulls urgency. When danger is quantified, it feels manageable. When consequence is deferred, it feels negotiable. Yet the ancient lesson contradicts this comfort. Low probability does not equal low impact. Rare events reshape worlds. The ancient catastrophe was not anticipated because it lay outside normal experience. That is precisely why it was catastrophic. Modern reliance on prediction risks repeating this blind spot. Models extrapolate from known ranges. They struggle with threshold behavior. Systems do not fail gradually when thresholds are crossed. They change state abruptly. Warnings intensify when scale increases. Energy concentration grows. Distance collapses. Speed accelerates. The old metaphors suddenly feel literal again. Fire from heaven becomes weaponry. Poisoned winds resemble contamination. Salted lands resemble ecological collapse. The language of ancient warnings reads less like allegory and more like observation. This recognition produces tension. On one hand, humanity prides itself on rationality. On the other, it senses familiarity in descriptions written by people who lacked modern vocabulary but not modern fear. The warning refuses to stay buried. It intrudes whenever capability begins to echo ancient scale. In response, societies often debate rather than act. Debate feels productive. It delays sacrifice. It preserves identity. Meanwhile, momentum continues. Systems optimized for efficiency resist slowing. Redundancy is labeled waste. Buffer zones are removed. Optimization sharpens vulnerability while masking it as sophistication. The warning also reshapes moral language. Ethics evolve as damage control. Virtues such as temperance, humility, and obedience gain prominence, not because they are noble in theory, but because they reduce risk in practice. Pride becomes vice because it precedes overreach. Overreach precedes collapse. This moral calculus is pragmatic, not idealistic. Yet warnings weaken when success persists uninterrupted. Stability breeds confidence. Confidence erodes restraint. Structures built to prevent escalation are reinterpreted as obstacles. Their original purpose fades. They become habits without explanation, then traditions without justification, then targets for removal. I often notice this transition when caution is reframed as fear, when limits are portrayed as regression, when slowing down is equated with weakness. This inversion mirrors the final stages before ancient collapse, when urgency overwhelmed humility and decisive action was mistaken for wise action. The warning does not forbid action. It forbids unexamined acceleration. It asks whether each step narrows future options or preserves them. It asks whether benefit is balanced against irreversible cost. It asks whether systems can absorb consequence or merely defer it. Ancient survivors reorganized around the warning because they had no alternative. Their world had already shrunk. They rebuilt smaller, slower, more cautiously. They learned that survival did not require dominance, only balance. The modern world resists this lesson because it still believes expansion is non-negotiable. Yet belief does not alter structure. Systems governed by physics respond to input regardless of narrative. Ecological thresholds do not negotiate. Infrastructure fails according to load, not intention. Climate responds to accumulation, not optimism. The warning is embedded in these responses. As the warning grows more abstract, it becomes easier to ignore. Environmental strain becomes background noise. Social fragmentation becomes normal. Systemic instability becomes manageable challenge. Normalization marks a decisive psychological shift. Danger no longer provokes reflection. It provokes adjustment. Adaptation without prevention creates illusion of control. Systems bend. Bending is mistaken for resilience. Yet each bend raises the threshold of tolerable harm. Acceptable loss enters language. Damage is balanced against benefit. What cannot be measured is often ignored. The ancient warning was sensory and undeniable. The modern warning is diffuse and delayed. This difference complicates response. Without a single defining event, collective memory fractures. Each group interprets danger differently. Consensus dissolves. Coordination falters. Despite this, the warning persists in subtle ways. Certain technologies provoke instinctive discomfort. Large-scale changes inspire unease disproportionate to immediate effects. Public debates echo ancient arguments about hubris and restraint, though often stripped of historical grounding. The instinct remains even when its origin is unknown. In the end, traveller, a warning is not a demand. It is an invitation to align before alignment is imposed. It does not threaten. It demonstrates. It shows where paths have led when limits were ignored. Whether it is recognized in time remains uncertain. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight, as the warning hums quietly beneath data, culture, and instinct, it is all right to not understand. The sky has always been humanity's first archive. Long before stone tablets or instruments, it was the place where patterns were noticed, recorded, and feared. It did not belong to anyone yet, it governed everything. Seasons followed its rhythms. Navigation depended on its stability. When the sky behaved as expected, the world felt ordered. When it did not, certainty collapsed. In the ancient catastrophe, the sky became something else entirely, not a backdrop, but an actor, traveller. When people describe fire falling from the heavens, they are not speaking poetically. They are reaching for language that can hold an experience without precedent. The sky assumed constant suddenly became dynamic. Light arrived too quickly. Heat followed without warning. Air itself became a carrier of harm. The relationship between above and below inverted. What had been distant became immediate. In astronomy, stability is an illusion maintained by scale. Stars burn predictably because their violence is far away. When energy enters proximity, perception changes instantly. Ancient observers did not understand orbital mechanics or atmospheric physics, but they understood violation. The sky had crossed a boundary. Something that should not happen had happened. This is why the sky occupies such a central role in ancient memory. It was not simply the source of weather or light. It was the domain of limits. Gods lived there not because it was mystical, but because it was unreachable. When destruction arrived from above, it shattered more than cities. It shattered assumptions about safety, distance, and control. The ancient accounts emphasize brightness before sound, light before impact. This sequence matters. In physics, it reflects extreme energy release. Light travels faster than pressure. Vision is overwhelmed before shock arrives. These details recur too consistently to dismiss. They suggest observation rather than invention. Afterward, the sky became suspect. Celestial events were scrutinized for meaning. Comets inspired fear. Unusual stars were watched carefully. Eclipses demanded ritual. This vigilance was not superstition. It was adaptive caution. When the sky has once delivered annihilation, every anomaly carries weight. Over time, this caution evolved into cosmology. The heavens were mapped meticulously. Movements were tracked. Patterns were catalogued. Prediction became a form of defense. If the sky could warn before striking again, humanity wanted to be listening. Astronomy was born not only from curiosity but from trauma. In my own quiet nights beneath instruments and charts, I feel this inheritance clearly. The sky is still where we look first when something feels wrong. Satellites hum softly overhead. Data streams arrive continuously. We watch for objects that move differently, that reflect light strangely, that do not belong. The fear is subdued, but it is present. Distance no longer comforts us the way it once did. The sky also taught humanity about scale. Events originating far above could erase everything below without intentional malice. This realization reshaped humility. Control felt smaller. Mastery felt conditional. Survival began to depend on awareness rather than dominance. As civilizations rebuilt, the sky remained a reference point for warning. Prophecy turned upward. Signs were read in stars. Endings were imagined as celestial disruptions. This was not because people expected gods to intervene constantly, but because history had taught them that the most transformative forces often arrive from beyond the horizon of expectation. Yet the sky is indifferent. It does not threaten. It does not reassure. It simply moves according to laws that do not prioritize human continuity. This indifference is its lesson. Safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. Stability is not permanence. Modern science has restored some confidence by explaining the sky's mechanics. Orbits are calculated, objects tracked, risks quantified. But explanation does not eliminate vulnerability, it reframes it. We now know that rare events carry disproportionate consequence, that certainty exists only within margins. The ancient catastrophe taught this viscerally. The sky became a reminder that civilization operates within systems far larger than itself, systems that do not respond to belief, morality, or intention. They respond to physics. As I sit with this understanding, the sky feels neither hostile nor benevolent. It feels ancient, patient, uninterested in our narratives. It reminds me that attention matters more than certainty, that humility is not weakness, but alignment. Tonight, as darkness stretches overhead and stars resume their quiet motion, it is all right to not understand. The earth remembers differently than we do. It does not tell stories and it does not forget. It records, Layer by layer, grain by grain, it keeps the evidence of what has passed through it. Where humans rely on memory and language, the planet relies on pressure, heat, fracture, and time. When something catastrophic occurs, the Earth does not interpret it. It absorbs it, reshapes itself around it, and carries the imprint forward in silence. Traveller. This is why the ground beneath the ruined cities matters more than the stories told about them. Words drift, meanings change, but soil altered. Beyond recovery remains altered. Stone melted and reformed remains altered. The Earth does not moralize, it does not exaggerate, it simply responds. In the region once known as the Fertile Plain, the Earth changed its mind about life. What had supported agriculture for generations became hostile to growth. Salt infiltrated soil. Minerals redistributed themselves in unfamiliar concentrations. Water turned heavy, bitter, resistant to use. These are not symbolic transformations, they are physical ones. And physical transformations do not reverse easily. In geology, recovery is measured in millennia, not years. A forest can regrow after fire, a river can return to course after flood. But land that has been chemically altered behaves differently. Seeds fail not because they are weak, but because the ground rejects them. Roots encounter environments no longer compatible with life. Farmers leave not because they fear curses, but because effort no longer yields return. This is the Earth's testimony. It explains why the region remained empty long after memory faded. People did not need stories to avoid it. The land itself discouraged return. This kind of abandonment is rare. It signals disruption beyond the normal cycle of destruction and rebuilding that defines human history. Archaeological layers confirm this. The break is sharp. Occupation stops abruptly. Debris does not accumulate gradually. It arrives all at once, compressed, chaotic, fused. The pattern does not resemble siege, flood, or earthquake. Those leave signatures of sequence. This leaves a signature of simultaneity. From an Earth system's perspective, simultaneity is key. It implies energy delivered faster than the environment can redistribute it. Heat without warning. Pressure without preparation. Matter forced into states it does not naturally occupy. The planet reacts by locking those states into its structure. Glass appears where clay should be. Shocked minerals form where compression should never reach. Microscopic spheres appear frozen droplets of vaporized material that cooled mid-air. These are not metaphors. They are physical artifacts with known formation conditions. The Earth does not care what caused them. Meteor explosion or something else entirely, it records outcome, not intention. What matters is that the conditions exceeded ordinary terrestrial processes. Something forced the environment beyond its tolerances. In my own work, hunched over samples under dim lab lights, I'm always struck by how unemotional this record is. There is no drama in a thin section of vitrified pottery, no judgment in a salinity spike, just quiet confirmation that something happened here that should not have happened under normal circumstances. This indifference is unsettling. It strips away comfort. It removes the possibility that catastrophe is reserved for moral failure or mythic exception. The Earth responds to forces, not values. When thresholds are crossed, consequences follow regardless of story. This is why ancient narratives shifted toward law and restraint after the catastrophe. Not because the Earth demanded obedience, but because survival required alignment with physical reality. The planet had demonstrated that it could be permanently altered, that life-supporting systems were not guaranteed. Once this realization settles in, behavior changes. Expansion slows, ambition narrows, stability becomes a priority. The Earth in this sense became the first teacher of limits. Even today this lesson persists. Regions scarred by ancient events remain fragile. Attempts to intensify agriculture fail. Infrastructure struggles. Recovery is partial at best. The land sets conditions that policy cannot override. Modern civilization often assumes that technology can negotiate with geology, that chemistry can be corrected, that ecosystems can be engineered back into balance. Sometimes this is true on small scales, but the Earth's deeper systems are slower and less forgiving. They do not respond to urgency, they respond to equilibrium. The ancient catastrophe forced a sudden renegotiation of that equilibrium. The Earth adjusted, humanity adapted afterward, not by restoring what was lost, but by moving away from it. This distinction matters. Adaptation does not mean reversal. It means acceptance of new constraints. The survivors of the catastrophe did not reclaim the poisoned land. They found it elsewhere. They learned to read subtle signs in soil and water. They avoided low basins. They prioritized resilience over yield. These choices were not philosophical. They were practical. The earth had spoken clearly enough. Tonight, as you listen and imagine layers of soil pressed gently beneath centuries of silence, remember that the planet is always thinking slowly. Erosion is time reflecting. Sediment is memory settling. And it is all right to not understand. Return does not mean going back to what was lost. In the long memory of civilization, return means something quieter and more cautious. It means approaching the edge of an old scar without stepping into it. It means revisiting questions that were once too dangerous to ask, while carrying the weight of everything learned since. Humanity's return after the ancient catastrophe was not a march toward reclaimed ground, but a slow circling around absence shaped by restraint rather than confidence. Traveller civilizations do not return to places the earth has rejected. They return to ideas. They return to patterns. They return to the boundaries that once saved them. Long after the poisoned valley was abandoned, people still oriented themselves by it. Routes curved away. Settlements formed at safer elevations. Memory migrated outward, embedding itself in law, ritual, and instinct rather than geography. This is how a return works at a species level. We do not step back into fire. We redesign our lives around the memory of its heat. The ancient world, stripped of certainty by sudden annihilation, rebuilt its sense of order slowly. Cities rose elsewhere, but they were different. Walls thickened. Water systems became more conservative. Storage mattered more than expansion. Redundancy replaced ambition. In my own nights spent reviewing maps and settlement data dust settling on paper under low light, the pattern is unmistakable. After the catastrophe, growth becomes careful. Networks become modular rather than centralized. Power disperses. No single city is allowed to dominate uncontested for long. The world becomes quieter, more fragmented, but more survivable. This was not decline, it was recalibration. The Earth had demonstrated that scale amplifies consequence. Smaller systems fail less catastrophically. They adapt faster. They leave room for error. Humanity, whether consciously or not, absorbed this lesson and encoded it into its social architecture. Religion changed too. Gods who once acted directly retreated into abstraction. Fire became symbol rather than instrument. Divine presence moved from open plains to mountain tops, deserts, sealed sanctuaries. These were not places of comfort. They were places of boundary. Approach was regulated. Contact was mediated. Distance became safety. The return to the sacred was not a return to intimacy. It was a return to caution. People learned that proximity to overwhelming power was dangerous even when framed as divine. Better to approach through ritual than exposure. Better to hear commands than witness force. This shift is visible in texts. Early myths are chaotic, filled with sudden destruction and direct intervention. Later traditions emphasize law, covenant, procedure. Rules multiply not because people love restriction, but because restriction proves survivable. The memory of total erasure lingered beneath every regulation. Technological return followed the same path. Knowledge was not abandoned, but it was layered. Dangerous understanding was slowed, filtered, restricted. Apprenticeship replaced revelation. Mastery required patience. Curiosity was encouraged only within limits. The idea that some knowledge should arrive too quickly became deeply suspect. This is not anti-intellectualism. It is risk management learned through loss. When a species realizes it can permanently damage its environment, it begins to treat discovery with caution. Every tool is evaluated not only for usefulness, but for consequence. Humanity's return to innovation was therefore uneven. Some advances accelerated, others stalled for centuries. Fire was mastered but contained. Metallurgy improved but remained localized. Energy was respected, not maximized. The world advanced, but it did so with brakes engaged. From the outside later, historians misread this as stagnation. but stagnation implies failure. This was survival strategy. It was this difference between continuing badly and continuing at all. The return also reshaped how humans understood time. Before the catastrophe, the future was assumed. After it, the future became conditional. Prosperity depended on restraint. Continuity required vigilance. The idea that everything could end suddenly entered collective consciousness and never fully left. This produced a strange duality. On one hand, societies planned for generations. On the other, they feared abrupt discontinuity. This tension shaped ethics. Obedience mattered. Humility mattered. Excess became dangerous not morally but structurally. In quiet moments, sitting with instruments humming softly beside me, I often think about how much of modern behaviour still reflects this inheritance. We build safeguards into systems we barely understand. We fear cascading failure more than single mistakes. We sense, without always articulating it, that some threshold should never be crossed. That instinct is ancient. It is the echo of return. Even today, when humanity edges toward capabilities reminiscent of the ancient catastrophe, the old language resurfaces. Fire from heaven becomes metaphor again. Poisoned winds resemble fallout. Salted land becomes contamination. We recognize the shape even when we deny the source. Return in this context is not nostalgia. It is recognition. It is the moment when the past stops feeling irrelevant and begins to feel instructional. The ancient world did not leave manuals behind. It left patterns. Those patterns are still readable if we are willing to slow down enough to see them. Civilization returned not to dominance but to balance, not to mastery but to management. The goal was no longer to reshape the world, but to remain within it. This shift allowed continuity. It allowed survival. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. The ancient catastrophe did not end humanity's story. It redirected it. Tonight, the universe whispers again, and it is all right to not understand. Reflection begins where certainty dissolves. After the dust settles and the evidence hardens into layers of soil and memory, what remains is not an answer, but a posture. Humanity did not emerge from the ancient catastrophe with clarity. It emerged with caution. That caution became the quiet architecture of civilization, shaping decisions long after the original cause faded beyond recall. Traveller reflection is not about reliving destruction. It is about noticing what changed afterward. The ancient world did not write treatises on restraint. It practiced it. Cities grew more slowly. Ambitions narrowed. Law thickened. The tone of existence softened from expansion to endurance. These shifts were not ideological. They were adaptive. When I sit alone with maps spread across a desk, instruments silent except for their low electrical breath, I am struck by how often restraint masquerades as humility in historical records. People believed they were obeying gods or honouring tradition, but beneath belief lay physics, beneath ritual lay survival strategy. Reflection in this sense is the mind catching up to the body's instincts. The catastrophe taught humanity that knowledge without pacing is dangerous, that power without boundary becomes indistinguishable from erasure. This lesson did not vanish when the event receded into myth. It embedded itself into how societies judged success. Longevity mattered more than brilliance. Stability outweighed transformation. Continuity became virtue. Reflection also reveals loss. Not everything survived the recalibration. Some forms of knowledge were abandoned because they were too volatile. Some ambitions were shelved indefinitely. The future became smaller but safer. Humanity traded reach for resilience even if it did not consciously frame it that way. This trade is difficult to accept in modern terms. We prefer narratives of progress, uninterrupted of growth without cost. But the ancient reflection embedded a different truth. Some costs are irreversible. Some mistakes do not invite correction. The Earth had demonstrated this without commentary. In geological time, reflection is erosion. Sharp edges soften. Evidence remains, but it is gentler, harder to read. Human reflection operates similarly. Over generations, fear becomes rule. Rule becomes habit. Habit becomes culture. Culture persists long after the reason for it disappears. This is why reflection matters now. Without it, habits lose meaning. Boundaries become obstacles. Restraint feels arbitrary. The danger is not forgetting the catastrophe itself. The danger is forgetting why restraint existed at all. Reflection requires slowing down. It requires looking at what societies consistently avoided rather than what they celebrated. It requires asking why certain technologies appeared late, why some landscapes remained empty, why law grew thicker instead of thinner. These patterns are not accidents. In quiet moments, watching data scroll past without drama, I feel a strange gratitude for uncertainty. Certainty invites action. Uncertainty invites pause. The ancient world learned to pause because it had no alternative. The modern world must learn to pause because it has too many. Reflection also reveals a paradox. Humanity became more capable after the catastrophe but less reckless. Tools improved. Knowledge accumulated. Yet ambition was moderated. This balance allowed survival across millennia. It was not optimal. It was sufficient. Sufficiency is an unfashionable concept. It does not promise glory. It promises continuation. The ancient reflection embedded sufficiency into ethics, myth, and governance. Pride became suspect. Excess became dangerous. Hubris was no longer merely a flaw, it was a threat. When later societies encountered fragments of older knowledge, they approached it cautiously. Rediscovery sparked wonder, but also fear. The idea that something powerful had been lost was matched by relief that it had lost it all. Reflection tempered curiosity. This tension never fully resolved. It cycles. Periods of confidence are followed by periods of restraint. Progress advances in waves, not lines. Each wave carries the memory of the last collapse, even if that memory is distorted. Reflection is how a species negotiates this cycle without repeating its most costly mistakes. It does not eliminate risk. It contextualizes it. It reminds us that not every capability demands expression. Tonight, as the story slows and the mind drifts toward rest, reflection offers something gentle. It does not demand understanding. It does not insist on answers. It simply invites awareness. Some mysteries wait, others watch, and it is all right to not understand. Descent is not a fall. It is a gradual surrender of tension, a soft agreement between thought and gravity. After reflection comes the quiet recognition that the mind has reached the edge of what it can hold tonight. The ancient catastrophe, once examined, measured and contemplated, no longer demands vigilance, it asks for rest. It, not forgetting, but settling. Not closure, but placement within something larger and slower than understanding. Traveller civilizations descend the way consciousness does before sleep. First sharp focus blurs, then distinctions soften. The urgency to resolve gives way to acceptance. Humanity after the catastrophe entered this descent collectively. It did not announce the shift, it simply stopped pushing at the same pace. Energy turned inward, structures thickened, time elongated. In this descent, ambition did not disappear. It learned to move quietly. Societies learned to operate under the assumption that stability was fragile. Expansion continued, but cautiously, as if testing the ground with each step. The Earth had demonstrated that not all surfaces support weight indefinitely. Descent became a survival instinct. I imagine ancient observers standing at dusk watching smoke thin into the upper air, the silence afterward heavier than sound. There is a moment after catastrophe when the world feels unreal, as if perception itself has been altered. That moment does not pass quickly. It stretches into generations. Descent begins there in the recognition that something irreversible has occurred. This is why later cultures emphasize continuity over spectacle, why they favored repetition over novelty. Descent teaches patience. It rewards predictability. It discourages sudden movement. In the long sleep that followed the ancient fire, humanity learned to breathe more slowly. Descent also reshapes how danger is perceived. Fear becomes background rather than alarm. Instead of reacting to threats, societies design themselves to avoid triggering them. Boundaries are placed far from edges. Excess is dampened before it accelerates. The goal is not triumph, but quiet persistence. In my own late nights when screens dim and instruments fall silent, I feel this descent personally. The data does not vanish, but it loses urgency. Patterns remain, but they no longer demand action. There is comfort in this shift. The universe does not require constant interpretation. Sometimes it only requires presence. The ancient survivors did not articulate descent as philosophy. They lived it as habit. They slowed construction. They simplified systems. They allowed inefficiency to exist because inefficiency creates buffers. Redundancy became protection. Descent favoured systems that could endure interruption. This wisdom persists in subtle ways. Even modern systems, when designed for resilience, borrow unconsciously from ancient caution. Backup systems fail safe margins of error. These are echoes of descent encoded into engineering language. They are acknowledgements that control is never complete. Descent is also humility in motion. It is the recognition that awareness has limits, that foresight is partial, that restraint is not weakness but alignment. The ancient catastrophe taught this without explanation. The earth enforced it without negotiation. As the story moves closer to sleep, the sharp outlines of myth and science soften into something shared. Radiation becomes whisper. Gravity becomes memory. Ruins become frozen echoes resting beneath layers of dust. Time itself feels less linear, more tidal. This is the space where sleep narratives belong, not at the peak of revelation but on the slope afterward, where the mind can rest without losing meaning, where uncertainty is no longer threatening. Descent allows the listener to feel small without feeling insignificant. The cosmos expands not as danger, but as context, carried by forces that do not require your vigilance. The ancient catastrophe, once feared as an ending, becomes something else in descent. It becomes a lesson embedded in rhythm rather than warning, a memory that no longer shouts, a shadow that cools rather than alarms. Civilization itself descended into this mode for centuries. Direct encounters with overwhelming power receded. Symbols replaced presence. Law replaced force. Distance replaced intimacy. These changes made the world survivable again. In descent, knowledge is no longer something to chase. It is something to sit beside. Understanding becomes optional. Acceptance becomes sufficient. This is not surrender to ignorance. It is trust in scale. When the mind releases the need to resolve, it opens space for rest. Sleep is not absence. It is recalibration. The ancient world recalibrated after devastation. Each generation inherited a quieter posture toward existence. Tonight that posture is offered again. Not as fear, but as invitation. The universe does not demand alertness from you now. It continues its slow processes regardless. Stars burn, stones erode, fields recover or do not according to laws older than thought. Descent into sleep mirrors descent into history. Sharp events blur into long consequence. Cause dissolves into pattern, meaning shifts from explanation to placement. Where does this story belong within the larger flow? As the listener drifts, the catastrophe becomes distant not because it was insignificant, but because it has been integrated. Integration is the opposite of erasure. It is the process by which trauma stops dominating attention and becomes part of structure. The earth integrates through sediment. Minds integrate through sleep. Let the images slow now. Let the valley rest under salt and moonlight. Let the tablets lie undisturbed in their cases. Let the instruments hum softly and then fade. Somewhere beyond our reach, something ancient still moves, but it does not require response tonight. Silence is the universe thinking, and it is all right to not understand. Sleep traveller, the cosmos will keep watch. Final does not mean ending, it means settling into scale. It is the moment when the mind stops reaching outward for resolution and instead allows itself to rest inside proportion. The ancient catastrophe traced across stone soil myth and silence does not conclude with an answer, because it was never a question in the ordinary sense. It was an event that exceeded explanation and therefore reshaped behaviour rather than belief. Civilization did not survive by understanding what happened. It survived by remembering that something had. Traveller. This is where the story becomes quiet enough to release you. Not because the mystery has been solved, but because it has been placed where it belongs. The ancient fire no longer demands vigilance. It does not call for fear. It exists now as structure, as inherited restraint, as a subtle pressure shaping decisions long after its light vanished from the sky. The lesson is not urgent anymore, it is ambient. In the final accounting, what mattered was not whether the catastrophe was cosmic, or engineered accidental or deliberate. What mattered was its permanence. It altered land beyond recovery. It ended cities without transition. It demonstrated without ambiguity that some forces erase futures rather than threaten them. Once that truth entered human experience, innocence could not return. Civilization adapted by becoming cautious. That caution became law, ritual, hierarchy, and habit. It became the preference for stability over brilliance, continuity over conquest, moderation over excess. These choices were not framed as wisdom at first. They were framed as survival. Only later did philosophy catch up. Over generations, restraint softened into tradition. Tradition hardened into norm. Norm became invisible. People forgot why certain things felt dangerous. They inherited the shape of caution without its origin. This forgetting did not remove the lesson. It merely buried it beneath culture. The earth continued to remember even when people did not. This is why the land matters. Salt does not moralize. Glass does not exaggerate. Shocked minerals do not tell stories. They simply persist. Long after empires rise and fall, they remain as quiet witnesses that something exceeded tolerance here. The earth does not debate thresholds. It enforces them. In modern times, humanity finds itself once again near capabilities that echo the ancient event. Energy concentration increases, complexity accelerates, distance collapses. Systems interlock tightly enough that failure propagates faster than response. These are not new conditions. They are familiar ones, scaled larger. What is new is awareness without memory. The ancient world lacked explanation but possessed fear. The modern world possesses explanation but struggles with humility. Data replaces instinct. Models replace caution. Probability replaces restraint. The assumption grows that anything can be managed after it begins. The ancient catastrophe contradicts that assumption. Once land was poisoned, no governance restored it. Once cities were erased, no administration recovered them. Adaptation occurred elsewhere at smaller scale under new constraints. Survival followed contraction, not control. This is the lesson that persists beneath myth. Systems pushed beyond tolerance do not negotiate. They transition abruptly into new equilibria that may not support previous forms of life or organization. Intent does not soften outcome. Intelligence does not override physics. Humanity learned this once at unimaginable cost. That learning reshaped civilization quietly. It limited ambition. It slowed expansion. It embedded humility into ethics long before ethics had language for it. The gods themselves receded, becoming symbols rather than forces, as if even imagination recognized the danger of proximity to overwhelming power. Over time, fear thinned. Boundaries became habits. Habits became obstacles. Obstacles became challenges. The modern world stands at this inflection. Capabilities expand faster than restraint. Systems reward acceleration. Growth becomes identity. Limitation feels like failure. Yet beneath surface narratives, unease grows. Anxiety rises alongside achievement. Trust in permanence erodes even as structures expand. People sense imbalance without agreeing on cause. This psychological atmosphere mirrors that which preceded ancient collapse when stability masked fragility. The difference now is scale. Ancient cities fell. A modern equivalent would affect planetary systems. The margin for correction narrows as complexity increases. Feedback loops accelerate. Cascades propagate globally. Resilience becomes harder to engineer retroactively. The ancient survivors did not debate restraint. They accepted it because alternatives vanished. The modern world still has alternatives, but fewer with each passing moment. Voluntary restraint remains possible, but increasingly costly. Enforced restraint arrives through consequence. History does not threaten. It demonstrates. It shows that civilizations do not fail because they lack intelligence, but because intelligence is deployed without humility. It shows that collapse is not punishment, but structural outcome. It shows that survival favors systems that respect limits before exceeding them. This does not require despair. It requires realism. It requires recognizing that not every capability must be exercised, that refusal can be a form of wisdom, that continuity across generations outweighs short-term dominance. These ideas conflict with modern narratives of progress, but they align with physical reality. The ancient catastrophe did not demand belief. It imposed conditions. The same principle governs all complex systems governed by physics rather than ideology. Once thresholds are crossed, outcomes follow regardless of intention. What remains unresolved is choice. Whether humanity will integrate this lesson consciously or relearn it through loss, whether restraint will be rediscovered as wisdom or reimposed as aftermath. The past offers no prophecy, it offers pattern. The pattern is clear, power concentrates, complexity increases, confidence replaces caution, warnings are acknowledged but deferred, adjustment arrives too late, systems fail abruptly, survivors adapt at reduced scale, continuity resumes elsewhere. Knowing this pattern does not guarantee avoidance. Recognition must translate into action. Action must occur before momentum overwhelms agency. This requires cultural transformation, not technical solution. It requires redefining success away from growth and toward persistence. Such redefinition is difficult. It demands sacrifice without immediate reward. It challenges identities built on expansion. It asks societies to slow down deliberately in a world optimized for speed. No civilization has attempted this at planetary scale. Success would represent a genuine evolutionary step. Failure would be repetition with variation. The ancient fire erased cities. A modern equivalent would erase systems upon which billions depend. The land would remember again, yet the story does not end in warning. It ends in agency. The ancient lesson is not despair. It is responsibility. It reveals that outcomes are shaped long before they arrive through patterns that can be recognized and altered. Civilization stands where memory and possibility intersect. As the narrative settles, there is no command, no conclusion, no demand. Only proportion. The universe does not require your certainty. It moves according to scales beyond vigilance. Tonight the ancient catastrophe becomes quiet again. Not forgotten, but integrated. A shadow that cools rather than alarms. A boundary that guides without shouting. Silence is the universe thinking. It is all right to not understand. Sleep, traveller. The cosmos will keep watch. The final quiet stretches a little longer the way twilight lingers after the sun has already slipped below the horizon. There is no urgency to leave this space. Endings like sleep work best when they arrive gradually, when the mind is allowed to loosen its grip without feeling abandoned. The ancient catastrophe fades further now, not because it has been dismissed, but because it has been fully absorbed into the larger rhythm that carries everything forward. In this wider rhythm, human history is only one slow pulse among many. Continents drift. Magnetic fields wander. Stars live entire lives between one human breath and the next. Against this scale, the destruction of cities, even civilizations, becomes less a singular tragedy, and more a moment of adjustment within an ongoing process. This does not diminish loss. It contextualizes it. Meaning survives not by resisting scale, but by accepting it. The Earth continues its work without commentary. Salt settles, minerals migrate. Water finds new paths. Given enough time, even the most violent disruption becomes a layer among layers. This is not healing in the human sense. It is accommodation. The planet does not restore what was, but it creates conditions for what can be. Life, when it returns, does so differently. Humanity mirrors this pattern. After every collapse, after every threshold crossed, it resumes, not where it left off, but where conditions allow. Cultures reform around absence. Values adjust to constraint. What looks like loss becomes the foundation of a new equilibrium. This has happened before, quietly, repeatedly, without ceremony. The ancient catastrophe was one such inflection. It did not end the story. It edited it. It removed certain paths permanently and forced others into prominence. Restraint became viable. Law became necessary. Distance became protection. These adaptations were not moral achievements. They were structural responses to reality. In the modern world, many of these responses still operate beneath awareness. Safety margins, redundancies, hesitations that feel irrational but persist anyway, an unease around irreversible change. These instincts did not arise from philosophy. They arose from memory embedded deeper than language. As you rest here, there is no need to resolve the question of what truly happened long ago. Meteor or weapon, accident or intention. Those distinctions matter less than the outcome. The earth was altered, human behavior changed, civilization adjusted. The pattern is complete even without explanation. This acceptance is a form of rest. The mind no longer has to chase certainty. It can settle into observation. In sleep, the brain does not solve problems. It reorganizes, it integrates, it decides what must be carried forward and what can be released. The universe does the same thing on larger scales. It expands, it cools, it reorganizes matter into new forms. Nothing is wasted. Even destruction becomes material for what follows. This is not optimism, it is physics. Somewhere beyond awareness, ancient forces still operate. Gravity folds space. Radiation drifts like a whisper across emptiness. Time erodes everything evenly without preference. Against these processes, human urgency is brief. This realization is not frightening. It is calming. It means the burden of vigilance does not belong to you alone. You are not required to keep watch tonight. The cosmos does that effortlessly. The stars do not sleep, but they also do not hurry. Their patience is absolute. As consciousness softens, the final lesson of the ancient catastrophe becomes almost gentle. It was never meant to be feared forever. It was meant to be integrated the way a scar becomes part of the body without demanding constant attention. The danger lies not in remembering too much, but in remembering nothing at all. Balance lives between those extremes. For now, balance means rest. It means allowing the story to dissolve into texture rather than meaning. Images blur, concepts loosen. The valley, the fire, the silence all drift backward into the deeper archive where they no longer demand response. Sleep arrives not as escape but as alignment, a return to scale, a reminder that existence continues whether or not it is understood. Some mysteries wait, others watch, and tonight, that is enough. We've reached the quiet edge of tonight's journey, traveller, where the ruins fade back into shadow and the sky grows wide again. We followed traces of fire and silence, of stone and memory through epochs that no longer speak aloud. What we found was not an answer, but a pattern resting gently beneath time. The universe continues untroubled by our conclusions. The past remains unfinished, layered beneath dust and language, waiting without urgency. Silence still holds what words cannot. It does not rush to explain itself. It only endures. In moments like this, it becomes easier to feel small without feeling afraid. To sense our fragility not as weakness, but as belonging. We are brief observers moving through systems older than thought, carried by gravity shaped by entropy, held together by memory and wonder. Some truths don't demand resolution. They ask only for attention. To sit beside them quietly and let them exist without pressure. Like ancient light still travelling through space. Like a story pressed shut, not ended, but resting. As the lantern dims and the chamber closes, allow the weight of the world to loosen. You don't need to carry the mystery any further tonight. Time will hold it for you. The cosmos is patient. Rest well, traveller. The universe will keep watch.